Montana Territory, February 1887. The snow had been falling for 3 straight days, thick and relentless, blinding even the horizon. Caleb Holt, 34, and widowed too young, had just finished thawing the ice from the barn trough when he spotted something odd, a winding line of boot prints barely holding shape in the deep snow. They weren't his, and no one came this far west of Billings unless they were hunting elk or running from something. Caleb's boots thudded heavy against the porch. The wind screamed past the cabin eaves as he unlatched the door. It was slightly open. That was wrong. Inside, his oil lamp flickered weakly in the chill. The hearth was cold. Everything else seemed untouched until he noticed the faint trail of melting snow across the floorboards leading toward the stove. Then, from the shadowed corner came a voice, tired, brittle, almost too quiet to catch. "I thought no one lived here. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trespass. I had nowhere else to go." He turned sharply, hands still hovering over the rifle rack. But what he saw wasn't a threat. It was a woman, young, mid-20s maybe. Her dress was soaked at the hem and crusted with ice, cheeks hollowed from cold and hunger. Her hair clung in damp ropes around her face, and her lips quivered not with fear but exhaustion. She looked ready to collapse. He didn't lower the rifle yet, just stared at her, blinking. "How'd you find this place?" "I saw the smoke." She motioned toward the chimney, her hand trembling. Kept walking toward it until I couldn't anymore. Caleb stepped further in, closing the door behind him. The temperature dropped 2 degrees instantly. He took a breath, then set the rifle back on the wall rack with slow deliberation. "Well," he said, "you made it just in time. Another hour out there and you'd have frozen solid." The woman gave the barest nod. Caleb fetched a thick wool blanket from the cupboard and wrapped it over her shoulders without touching her skin. She flinched anyway, habit or trauma, he didn't know which. He moved to the hearth, striking flint to kindling. Sparks danced. Soon the stove began to breathe warm life into the cold air. The woman didn't speak as she watched him. Not even as he poured a tin cup of hot water from the kettle and placed it in her hands. When she sipped it, her eyes fluttered shut for a second, like the heat was the first real thing she'd felt in hours. Caleb finally pulled off his snow-caked coat and hung it near the fire. The silence between them stretched, but it didn't feel tense anymore, just waiting. "You from around here?" he asked. She shook her head. "I came on the Northern Pacific, from Kansas. I was supposed to meet someone in Bitter Ridge. You mail order." A hesitation, then a nod. Caleb folded his arms, and he didn't show. She looked up. No. They stared at each other. Snow tapped softly on the window panes behind her, but inside the warmth slowly wrapped around them both. He didn't know why he didn't ask her to leave. Maybe it was the way her eyes looked both broken and brave at the same time. Maybe it was because he hadn't heard another voice in weeks. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because something about her felt like a second chance. "I'm not much for talking," he muttered, standing. "But if you need a place to warm up, the fire's yours." She lowered her head. "Thank you." Caleb looked at her one last time, then turned toward the kitchen. "What's your name?" "Clara," she whispered. "Clara," he repeated softly. "Well, I'm Caleb." He started ladling cornmeal into a pot for supper, and she stayed where she was, still wrapped in the blanket, still silent but no longer shivering. Outside, the storm howled. But inside that cabin, something small and real had taken root. Not love, not yet. But maybe the space where love could begin. The storm didn't break overnight. Instead, it deepened, thickening like a wool blanket thrown over the world. Caleb didn't sleep much. He sat in his worn leather chair boots propped near the fire eyes, drifting to Clara curled on the bench beneath the window. The wool coat swallowed her frame, and her breath steamed in and out in soft rhythms. Every now and then she twitched, murmuring something in her sleep. He didn't move, just kept the fire alive and the cabin warmer than it had been in weeks. By dawn, the fire was still burning, though the wind outside had only grown crueler. Caleb stirred the embers and quietly added a few logs. Clara was awake now, sitting up slowly, brushing loose strands of hair from her eyes. She looked around disoriented at first, then landed on him with a wary nod. "I didn't mean to take your bench," she said softly. He shook his head. "You took the cold out of it. It's better now." She looked like she might smile, but didn't. He poured 2 cups of pine tea from the kettle and handed one to her. Clara accepted it with both hands, murmuring her thanks. They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the faint whistle of wind through the eaves and the crackle of the fire. Then, finally, Caleb spoke. "You hungry?" Clara hesitated. "Yes, but I'll help." "You don't have to." "I wanna," she said more firmly this time. He stood nodding toward the cupboards. "Salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal. Not much, but enough. You ever make skillet bread?" Clara rose to her feet slower than before, but steadier. "I can make do." He watched her roll up her sleeves. Her hands were small but capable fingers, slightly red and cracked from cold and travel. She moved with purpose, not quite confidence, but resilience. As she began measuring cornmeal into a bowl, Caleb pulled out the iron skillet and set it over the fire. "Where were you supposed to go?" he asked. She kept her eyes on the flour. "A man named Curtis Holloway. Wrote through the Denver agency. Said he had a store in Bitter Ridge and needed a wife to help keep books and tend the counter. Said he'd meet the coach. He didn't." "No," she said. "I waited 3 hours in the snow. Then the station master told me I could try walking to the next town. I made it 5 miles before the wind almost knocked me down. Then I saw your chimney smoke." Caleb leaned on the table, watching her stir. "You could have died out there." "I know." Her voice was flat, but I didn't. She poured the batter into the skillet with practiced ease. He could smell the faint sweetness of sugar she must have found in the corner tin. It reminded him of Sundays from a lifetime ago, when his wife used to bake before the fever took her. He moved slowly to set out 2 plates and knives. "Clara," he said quietly, "you can stay until the storm clears. We'll figure out the rest later." She paused, spoon in hand, looking at him like she wasn't sure if she'd heard him right. Then she nodded just once. As the bread browned and the scent filled the cabin, Caleb sat down across from her again. He hadn't meant to let her in, hadn't meant to start talking either. But somehow her presence filled a space in the cabin that had gone silent for far too long. They ate together without saying much. Clara offered him half her slice before taking her own. He watched as her fingers slowly stopped trembling as color crept back into her cheeks. Afterward, she cleared the table without being asked and rinsed the dishes in warm water. Caleb didn't stop her. Later, he handed her an extra quilt and set it near the hearth. "It's warmer there," he said. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and returned to his chair. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and deep. But inside, for the first time in a long while, the house felt like it had 2 heartbeats instead of 1. The storm refused to let up. On the second morning, the snow had piled nearly 4 feet against the barn's north wall, sealing the world in white. Clara rose early before Caleb and was already standing at the wash basin when he came back in from feeding the mule. She wore a thick flannel shirt of his mended at the cuff and had her hair pulled back in a makeshift ribbon from her satchel. "You don't have to work," he said, setting down his gloves and shaking snow from his coat. "You're still a guest." "I'd rather not feel useless," she replied, scrubbing a plate with steady rhythm. "I believe in earning heat and tea." He watched her for a moment. Fair enough. Caleb moved to the stove and poured hot water over coffee grounds, the smell filling the cabin in seconds. Clara sat at the table patching a frayed sleeve on one of his older shirts. She stitched with care, fingers graceful but deliberate, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. "Where'd you learn to sew?" he asked, sitting across from her. "My mother," she said, "before she passed. After the war, took my father. Sewing was how we stayed fed." He nodded slowly. "You said you came from Kansas." "Lawrence." "I worked as a nurse there during the cholera outbreak. Afterward, I was alone. Boarding house didn't take charity, and I didn't have much left to give. That's when I saw the mail order ad." Her voice didn't shake, but there was a distance in it, like she'd tucked away the worst of it behind her eyes. Caleb didn't pry. He'd buried his own ghosts without markers, and he recognized that tone someone walking through loss, not running from it. "What about you?" she asked, not looking up from her stitching. He sipped the bitter coffee. "Born here, grew up on this land, inherited it after my folks passed. My wife died 2 winters ago, scarlet fever." Clara looked up. "I'm sorry." He nodded, but didn't say more. The pain had softened with time, but never vanished. It just lived quieter now, like a dull ache under the ribs. After breakfast, they fell into a rhythm. Clara swept the cabin floor while Caleb chopped more kindling. She hummed to herself when she thought he couldn't hear a soft, uncertain tune that reminded him of lullabies from another life. By late afternoon, the wind picked up again, and they both retreated inside. Caleb stoked the stove until it glowed, and Clara pulled out her bag to organize what little she had. A few buttons, a sewing kit, a hand mirror, and a folded piece of paper yellowed at the edges. She held it for a long moment before opening it. A snowflake cut carefully, intricately crooked stars and arrows sliced through it. He saw her fingers tremble. "My fiancé made this before Gettysburg," she said, not looking at him. "Said he'd make 100 more when he came back." "He didn't?" Caleb asked gently. Clara shook her head. "The last letter came with this." Then nothing. Caleb leaned forward. "I was at Gettysburg. Left side of the second day. Lost 2 ribs and most of the hearing in this ear," he said, tapping the side of his head. She blinked at him as if seeing him differently now. "So you know." "I do." The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of memories they didn't need to explain. Caleb stood, walked to the mantel, and pulled out a cracked frame. Inside was a faded photograph, a woman with auburn hair and a crooked smile. He set it on the table next to Clara's snowflake. "My wife, her name was Lydia." Clara reached out and gently moved the snowflake just slightly, so it sat beside the frame but didn't touch it. "She looks kind," she whispered. She was. Neither of them spoke after that. Caleb lit a fresh lamp and added 2 more logs to the fire. Clara resumed sewing. He sat beside her, content to just listen to the rustle of thread and the wind beyond the walls. Somehow, their grief had found company. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel quite so heavy. On the 3rd day, the wind roared so hard it shook the shutters on the east side of the cabin. Snow pressed against the window panes like a second wall sealing them in. The world beyond had disappeared beneath drifts, and even the barn roof groaned under the weight. Inside, the air was warm but thick with the closeness of shared breath and quiet thoughts. Caleb salted a cut of pork and hung it near the stove to dry. Clara sat by the window, patching the hem of her dress with methodical hands, the rhythm of her needle stitching somehow steadying the tension in the room. They spoke little that day, but their movements had fallen into unspoken patterns. He fetched the water, she boiled it. She swept the corners, he chopped firewood. When one paused, the other filled in the silence with gentle presence. By early afternoon, Caleb noticed a strip of skin on the back of his left hand had cracked open, angry and red from cold exposure. He hissed and wiped it on a cloth. "You should have said something," Clara murmured already, reaching for her satchel. "I've had worse," he said, brushing it off. "So, have I," she replied softly, pulling out a tin of balm. She knelt beside him and dipped her fingers into the salve, spreading it over the cracked skin with practiced care. Caleb flinched not from pain, but from her touch tender in a way he hadn't felt in years. She wrapped his hand in linen and tied it off. Her face was close to his, but her gaze remained focused on her work. When she was done, she stood without fanfare and returned to her corner. That evening, he noticed she hadn't touched her tea. Wordlessly, he poured the last of the pine brew into her cup and left his own empty. Clara glanced at the cup, then at him. She said nothing, only nodded once and wrapped her fingers around the warm tin. After dinner, they lingered by the fire longer than usual. Caleb sat on the floor this time, not the chair leaning against the wall, his legs stretched out and his shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. Clara sat opposite him, her knees pulled close, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the quilt he'd loaned her. "I used to count time in letters," she said quietly. "One every week, sometimes more. After a while, I stopped expecting them, but I still checked the post anyway." He looked at her, not speaking, just listening. "I never stopped hoping," she added, voice thinner now. "Even when I knew." Caleb stirred the fire with a stick. "Hope's a funny thing. It doesn't die easy. Just gets quieter." She smiled at that barely. "And sometimes it whispers in the wind." The room went still, but it wasn't hollow. The storm still battered the roof, but inside there was something stronger anchoring them to this place. Maybe not love, not yet, but trust was beginning to grow roots. Later that night, Clara tucked herself into the bedroll near the fire while Caleb cleaned the dishes. She looked peaceful, curled in layers of wool and quiet. He watched her for a moment, then went to the corner where he kept old tools and pulled out a small board of pine. Kneeling near the fire, he took a heated metal poker and slowly burned words into the wood. "This cabin is no longer a place of silence." He leaned the board above the hearth, right where the mantel began. Then, gently, he placed a sprig of lavender beneath it, dried delicate, something he'd saved since Lydia. He whispered to no one, "It's time for warmth again." Clara stirred slightly in her sleep, but didn't wake. Outside, the snow still fell. But inside the cabin, for the first time in years, Caleb Holt didn't feel alone. He felt watched over. Or perhaps he was the one watching now over something fragile, something new. And in that stillness, the line between survival and living began to blur. The storm finally broke on the fifth morning. A strange brightness filled the sky, weak but clean, like the world had been scrubbed by snow and wind and laid bare. Caleb rose early, hitched the mule to the sled and wrapped Clara in his spare wool coat before they set out for the town of Galloway. The 20-mile trek over crusted snow and icy ruts was slow, but they traveled in silence, the kind that didn't ache anymore. Clara kept her eyes on the hills ahead, her gloved fingers gripping the sled rail. Caleb drove with jaw set tight, unreadable, but more watchful than ever. By midday, the town emerged like a mirage. Plumes of smoke curling from chimneys, the metallic sound of boots on frozen boardwalks, and voices too loud for the hush the snow had laid over the world. They reached the white clapboard church first. It stood squat, with frost glinting along the windows and a bell tower that hadn't rung in weeks. Caleb tied the mule to the rail and helped Clara down. Inside, the warmth hit first, then the quiet. 3 women sat knitting near the back pews. One looked up, narrowed her eyes. Pastor Whitmore, a thick-set man in his 60s with a crooked collar, descended the aisle when Caleb called his name. "We need a place for her," Caleb said plainly. "Mail order bride, abandoned up north. She's no trouble." The pastor frowned, flipping through a worn leather ledger. "Name." "Clara Bennett," she said, voice steady. He scanned the pages, then shook his head. "No record. No man signed for her. No deposit from Bitter Hollow. She's not legally wed," the pastor concluded. "I never claimed I was," Clara said softer. Behind them, the whisper came sharp as a pin. "She's one of the rejects." Another woman added louder this time. "Come all that way just to be passed around." Clara's shoulders stiffened. Her breath caught. She turned toward the door, her feet backing up. Caleb didn't speak. Not yet. Clara stepped outside, standing under the awning, arms wrapped taut. The snow had started again, fine, soft like ash. He followed her out. "I'm not who you think I am," she said, barely louder than the breeze. "I know exactly who you are." Caleb replied, his voice low and steady. "You came out of the storm. You sewed my sleeve. You boiled tea when I had nothing but cold water. You cleaned ash from my stove, and you never once asked for anything." She blinked. Her lips trembled. "I brought you here thinking someone would claim me." "You were," he said. "I just didn't know it was going to be me." She looked up at him, really looked. And in that second, something between them shifted. "I'm not clean," she whispered. "Not untouched, not unmarred." "I'm not whole," he replied. "Not unchanged." And then, as if the universe couldn't tolerate stillness too long, the clatter of hooves broke the moment. A wagon pulled into the churchyard, black, high-sided with a polished finish too clean for this rough country. The door creaked open. A tall man stepped out. Long, tan coat, silver buckles on his boots, a smug grin stretched across his face like varnish. In his hand, a folded paper. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look who made herself cozy." Caleb stepped forward. "Can I help you?" "Name's Roy Mercer," the man said. "That's my bride." He held up the paper, smug. "Signed contract. Paid through the Denver agency. That makes her mine." Clara paled. Caleb didn't move. Roy took another step. "You hiding my property, cowboy." And then he pushed. That was the last thing he did without consequence. Caleb staggered back one step, found his balance, then swung. His fist caught Roy's jaw squarely. The man stumbled, blood blooming from his nostrils, splattering on the snow. Neighbors had gathered near the edge of the churchyard, watching in silence. No one moved. Roy wiped his face, held up the contract. "She's mine. Bought and paid." Caleb disappeared into the cabin and returned a moment later with a leather pouch worn heavy. Inside was silver paper bills and everything he'd saved over 3 hard years. He tossed it at Roy's feet. "That's what you paid. Plus more. Now she owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Roy opened the pouch, eyes flicking wide. "You win this one," he muttered, backing up, climbing into the wagon. As the wheels turned away, crunching through snow, the church bell tolled once, not for a wedding, not for a funeral, but maybe for something beginning. Clara stood silent as the wind lifted her hair. Caleb reached for her hand. "You called her mail order," he said to the onlookers. "I call her a miracle." They didn't speak much on the ride back from Galloway. Clara sat beside Caleb on the sled, her hand nestled in his gloved one, the pouch of silver tucked deep in his coat. The sky had turned lavender behind the clouds, snow whispering down like forgiveness. When they reached the ranch, it was nearly dark. Inside, Caleb relit the fire with swift, practiced motions. Clara stood near the doorway, still wrapped in his coat, her face unreadable. Then, as if waking from a long dream, she stepped forward, grabbed the broom from the corner, and began sweeping the floor with deliberate strokes. Caleb watched her for a long moment, then moved to unpack a small wooden table from the storage shed, something he'd carved years ago but never used. He brought it inside, sanded the top smooth with a cloth, and set it near the window. Clara paused her sweeping and smiled faintly, a soft approval in her eyes. The next day they fell into rhythm again, but now it was different, intentional. Clara sewed patches onto his shirts without asking. Caleb showed her how to crack the ice at the well. She wiped the windows with vinegar water, while he built a rack to dry more firewood indoors. Their tasks were ordinary, their gestures small, but they held weight. Late that afternoon, as snow still drifted lazily, a knock came at the door. Caleb opened it to find a little girl no more than 7. Her shawl threadbare, her cheeks wind-burned, her boots damp with slush. She held a tin bucket, empty, but for a few stray wood chips. "Mr. Holt," she said shyly, "my aunt said I should ask. Could I have some kindlin'? We're out." Caleb knelt to eye level. "What's your name?" "Molly," she whispered. "We live down the ridge near the dry creek." Before he could answer, Clara stepped in, holding out a warm piece of cornbread she'd just pulled from the skillet. "Take this too," she said, smiling. "Kindlin's no good on an empty stomach." Molly blinked at the offering, eyes wide with surprise. Caleb handed her a bundle of dry wood tied with twine and gently set it into her bucket. "If your aunt needs more, send word, or come back," he added. Molly curtsied in a way that was too practiced for a child, then scampered off through the snow. Clara closed the door softly behind her. Her back stayed against it for a moment longer than necessary. "I should have warned you not to open the door," she murmured. Caleb reached out, brushed a crumb from her sleeve, and rested the empty skillet on the table. "You don't have to face hunger alone anymore." That night, the wind hummed low outside, but inside the cabin there was laughter. The quiet kind born from a shared glance or the way Caleb's boot squeaked against the floorboard he meant to replace. Clara baked a second round of cornbread, and Caleb showed her how to split logs along the grain, their hands brushing once then again. Neither of them pulled away. As the fire died down, Caleb brought out a narrow plank of dark oak and set it near the hearth. With a hot poker, he burned a phrase into the wood, simple, steady. "This is no longer a house of silence." Then he placed a sprig of dried lavender beneath it, tied with twine. Clara didn't speak, but she knelt beside him and rested her head briefly against his shoulder. That night, as they settled into their corners of the room, the air felt full, not crowded, but complete. Outside, the wind tugged at the shutters. Inside, the cabin breathed, and for the first time in years, it felt like a place where someone had come to stay, not just to survive the storm, but to build a life after it. Spring came late that year. It crept in slowly, with icy mornings that turned soft by noon and snowmelt that whispered along the rocky edges of the stream behind the barn. The sky stayed gray for weeks, then opened wide with a blue so clean it hurt to look at. On one such morning, Caleb and Clara stood side by side atop a small grassy knoll that overlooked the valley. The grass was still damp, dotted with patches of stubborn snow. Below them, Galloway slept quiet in the distance, chimney smoke rising steady from rooftops. No ribbons fluttered, no music played, just the land, the sky, and the hush of wind wrapping around them like an unseen guest. They hadn't planned a wedding. Neither of them had wanted fanfare. What they stood for now wasn't ceremony, it was survival turned into sanctuary. Clara wore a simple white dress hand-sewn by the old widow who once handed her a loaf of bread at the church. The hem was uneven, the thread mismatched, but the way it moved in the breeze made her look like something sacred, like the first flower pushing up through frozen soil. Caleb wore his oldest shirt, faded and mended sleeves rolled just above the wrist. In his breast pocket, he'd tucked a dried sprig of lavender. His boots were scuffed. His hands were calloused. But his eyes were clear. The same preacher who'd once turned Clara away from the church stood before them now, humbled, older voice softer. "I've read many vows," he said, "but none more real than the silence between these two people. There's no paper here, no witness but the wind. And maybe that's enough." Caleb stepped forward. From his coat, he pulled a thin braid of dried meadow grass knotted at one end, fraying at the other. "Not a vow for show," he said, voice steady. "A promise. In dust and years, in storms yet to come. I'm yours, Clara, fully." Clara's voice was no louder than a whisper, but it rang clear. "And I've been mine always. But now I'm yours too." He tied the braid around both their wrists awkwardly but securely. As he did, a small brown sparrow landed on a fence post nearby. Molly, standing beside the old widow, clapped her hands and laughed. "They got wings now," she cried. The crowd chuckled, not mockery, but relief. The kind that comes when a wound has finally scabbed and you're no longer afraid to move again. After the quiet ceremony, friends and strangers alike left gifts, bundles of dried sage jars of plum, preserves a carved toy horse for Molly. Clara kissed each person on the cheek. Caleb shook hands with men he hadn't spoken to in months. Then he turned to Clara. "There's something I want to show you," he said. They walked hand in hand through the field, past the barn, and up the slope where a single oak stood watch over the valley. Beneath it was a small wooden cross, weathered unmarked. My father, Caleb said, kneeling beside the cross. "I buried him here when the fever took him. It's where I used to come to ask questions, even when I didn't expect answers." From beneath the earth, he pulled out a pine box. The hinges creaked but held. Inside, 2 photos, one of his mother, laughing with a lamb in her arms. The other, Clara and Molly seated on the porch, sunlit, unaware the moment had been captured. He set them side by side. "Now they're both here," he said, "2 women who gave me life." Clara didn't speak. She just knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "And 2 souls that found each other," she whispered. "Not through letters, but through loss." That evening the cabin glowed with candlelight. Clara baked cornbread that filled the air with sweetness. Molly played on the floor with the straw doll. Caleb sat in his chair, the same one he'd carved in solitude years ago, but it creaked now under the weight of 2 small hands resting on his shoulders. Outside, chickens clucked, water boiled, wind tapped at the shutters. But the loudest sound of all came from Caleb's heart. Once hollowed by grief, it now pulsed with something deeper than hope. Love. Not just found, but chosen, and stayed. Not all vows need gold or velvet or chapels to be real. Sometimes they're forged in frost, mended in silence, and spoken with hands instead of voices. Caleb and Clara didn't find each other because they were perfect. They found each other because they endured. Because pain didn't close them, it opened them. Their story is a reminder that love can begin in the loneliest corners. That second chances often arrive without fanfare. That a cabin once built for survival can become a home when trust is added one gesture at a time. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts. Share your hope. And if you believe love is not a destination, but a journey walked through storms, subscribe to Whispers of the Wild West. because out there across silence and snow, someone's heart is waiting to be found.